Okay, check 1 2, check 1 2. Should be live. How's it going, memes of destruction? So we should have a good stream today. There's a great talk that took place between Bernardo Kastrup and Brian Keating that we are going to discuss. And we are going to discuss its relationship with sentient singularity theory as well, because there was much said that is highly relevant, and many of the questions that were asked in this stream are answered by sentient singularity theory, and we'll explain why. So many things to touch on. So here we go. Oh, by the way, before I get started, housekeeping, I guess. There will not be a Discord call this week because it is my wife's birthday. And so I will be occupied. I might reschedule it. I might not. We'll see. It's right before the holidays, I know, so it's kind of crazy, but we'll see what happens. All right. So this is the discussion that we are going to talk about. It is on Brian Keating's Into the Impossible podcast, which should not be of any surprise to those who follow this channel. This is it. It was called Bernardo Kastrup, the metaphysics of physics, or something like that. And it seems to have changed today, actually. I think Brian changed it to Skeptical About Superdeterminism. I liked the original title, to be honest. But it is a cool thumbnail. As I've stated in my recent video, that I entered into the Pace 1 contest that is put on by Kirchheim Mungel and the Theories of Everything channel. Metaphysics is the field of a theory of everything, and it is not a physics theory. And the progress that we will be making in physics will be done first through metaphysics, and then linked with physics, and then you'll get a bunch of breakthroughs. Apologize for my voice. I don't know, I have some kind of cold or something. But, so here we go. This is the background of Bernardo Kastrup. Real quick, I know I've gone over it before, but it is good to mention before the stream because it frames his perspective, which is very important. So Bernardo Kastrup is, let's go to his website. He talks about analytic idealism. He's an idealist. He's not a materialist. He thinks ideas are the fundamental, I guess you could say he believes consciousness is the fundamental structure of reality, and that ideas are emergent from that, and that physics is a construct of measurement, essentially, or observation of by consciousness, so that consciousness causes the emergence of the perspective of materialism, essentially, which I agree with 100%. He's completely correct. But this is his website, and I wish that it had more of an about, I guess, but he is his interests include philosophy of mind and ontology, and multidisciplinary argument for the mental nature of reality. So basically he's an author of The Idea of the World, a multidisciplinary argument for the mental nature of reality, which is a great title. I agree with exactly what it says. Then there is Brian Keating, who I've introduced on this channel before multiple times, but he is a professor of physics, an American cosmologist at the University of San Diego. This is his Wikipedia page. He wrote 2 books, Losing the Nobel Prize and Into the Impossible. But he's an experimental physicist. So, without further ado, let's get into the first clip. I'm going to try and keep it pretty concise here today, guys. I know every time I say it's like, oh, it's going to be 2 hours or less. It's like 3.5 hours. So we're trying. They used to be like 4.5 hours, and I will get better about the timestamps. But this is the first clip. This first clip
the kind of maybe complex, or maybe you could,
is about studying consciousness scientifically and whether or not it's possible. So, here you go.
you could comment on the work of, in particular, Donald Hoffman. When I think about you, I think about different analogies for consciousness, and I've come to the feeling that it's almost hopeless. I've had on David Chalmers and the coiner of the hard problem of consciousness. I want to ask you, where does a professional kind of feel that this notion of either consciousness as a possibility within the scientific enterprise? First of all, is there a role for science and consciousness? Let me ask you that to begin with.
There clearly is a role for a science of the contents of consciousness, I think, because they are our primary interface to reality. What you are never conscious of, directly or indirectly, might as well not exist. Now, a science of consciousness in the sense of trying to reduce consciousness, trying to explain consciousness in terms of something else that isn't consciousness itself, that I think is hopeless, because we cannot play the reductive game forever. We cannot keep on reducing one thing to another forever unless we engage in circular reasoning. So at some point, we hit sort of the bottom level of reality, and we can then explain everything else in terms of that ontological primitive that we find at the end, but we can't explain the ontological primitive itself. And that's inevitable. Whatever one's theory of nature is, you have to come down to at least one ontological primitive. And I think consciousness is it. I think we can make sense of everything else in terms of consciousness, but we cannot reduce consciousness, awareness, phenomenality itself to something else. And the attempt to do that, I think, is hopeless and leads to the signs of internal contradictions that we refer to as the hard problem of consciousness, for instance.
And that calls back to Galileo, which I think Philip Goff, who's a past guest on the podcast as well, spoke about Galileo's error, which was, as far as I understand it, this primitive notion of the hard problem in the context of, can something inside the medicine bottle ever really read what's on the outside label? And I do feel like there is an incredible, gap between what we do work on in actual, sort of proper scientific reasoning with instruments and so forth, and reproducibility. It seems almost impossible to think, though, that we could ever reproduce or have a control group with consciousness.
Okay, this is exactly what I talked about in my latest video, is that many questions cannot be answered from within the system. You need an outside view or God's eye view, as I've stated, and he's right when he says, can you read what's on the outside label of a medicine bottle from within the bottle, essentially? And you have to be shown essentially the outside label, but you can actually extrapolate what's on the outside label, but it's very difficult to do it, and there's many false paths that are very easy to turn down, and I understand this because I turned down many of them on the path that I have been on, getting to the point that I'm on at now, and basically, I do agree with Bernardo Kastrup. You get to this point where if you're going to say what is the base nature of reality, then you have to arrive essentially at consciousness, because there is no instance of isolatable instance in which you can perceive the absence of it, because perception itself is part of consciousness. So I've stated that he said that you get into circular reasoning. That is actually totally acceptable at the fundamental level of reality. To get into a circular reasoning, you get into what is the fundamental nature of reality is sentience. What is sentience? It is a knot of entangled perspectives, essentially, and that is circular reasoning, because a knot of entangled perspectives is a sentient being. A sentient being is a knot of entangled perspectives, and it's just a circle. But the thing about this circle that is important is that it is directional, okay? That is very key here, is a circular reasoning, when it's done properly, which it must be done properly, actually, at a fundamental level, is one that is not bidirectional, I guess. It is unidirectional in its expression. Sentience I guess you could say before, or is primary to, not really before, but is primary to perspectives, because there is no way for perspective to exist without a sentient being. And that's true the kind of the reverse way, but it's not really, because what comes before a perception is a perceiver, okay, in a directional, I guess, in a hierarchy of directionality. So it is circular reasoning at the fundamental level, but it is also directional at a fundamental level, and that's totally okay, because that's totally true. It's not a problem where people say, oh, well, then you get into problems of circular reasoning. There is no problem with circular reasoning at the fundamental level. In fact, it is a necessity, but it must be directional in order to give context still, because context is of the utmost importance in order to build. As I've stated before many times on here, context is key, and you cannot have context without directionality or without a hierarchy. So sentient being comes before its perspectives in a hierarchy, or is primary to its perspectives, even though it is composed of its perspectives as well, which I understand that that's different from every other structure that we know, but obviously that would be the case. So it's not a problem. It's a necessity. And so I agree with him, except for the fact that I think that a circular reasoning is an inevitability. It's not a problem, but it must be directional in its expression. And that's very important. But I do agree with Bernardo Kastrup, essentially, that the fundamental nature of reality is sentience, and that's what Sentient Singularity states. In my video, my latest video, we will look at a clip of it because it's highly relevant to this. There is part of it where you have to have base assumptions about reality, and we'll right after this next clip of Bernardo and Brian, we will take a look at it. And you can actually form at least two specific base assumptions about reality, about its structure and its nature simultaneously. Reality is a coin, so is consciousness, or sentience. And on one side you have mind, or heads, and on the other side you have tails, which is a knot of entangled perspectives. But this structure of a sentient being is a superposition structure. So it has two sides that exist at once, and you cannot look at both sides at the same time. So it has a nature and it has a structure simultaneously. You can deduce the base structure of reality and the base nature of reality, and you don't need any scientific instruments. And I'll explain why, though this is this seems like a cop-out, but it's not, because there's no way to avoid this as the answer to these two questions, or these answers to these two questions of what is the base nature of reality, what is the base structure of reality. And if you can't avoid something, then lean into it. Consciousness cannot be avoided. So here, this is done through introspection, and they talk about this right here.
Poses a certain metaphysical assumption, which is that, well, consciousness is reducible, and that the correlation between brain activity and consciousness is a causal one. And that I think is hopeless. And to complement the neuroscience of consciousness, I think the way to go is to have introspective investigation, which is not science. We should not add introspection to science, because it will break the back of science's horse, and we will lose a very, very useful horse that we should keep and protect and maintain healthy. But in addition to science, I think it would be very productive, even for the scientists who practice the science of consciousness, to develop a little more sophisticated introspective awareness, to know a little bit more firsthand what it is that they are actually studying. Because the level of introspective naivete amongst philosophers of mind and neuroscientists of consciousness is sometimes scary. It's soaring.
Because why do you say that?
Well, because one is dedicating one's life to studying consciousness, which can only be actually known from introspection, a first-person perspective.
Bingo! Yahtzee! Damn! I didn't even hear that first part when I listened to it, to be honest. But just watch. So this, if you have not seen, was my recent video that I did for the... Okay, let's see here. Pace 1 contest. And in it, I say that you have to have a base... you have to have base assumptions about the nature of reality, and that those base level assumptions, those fundamental assumptions, must be deduced from first-hand information. It cannot be based on second-hand information. I specifically state this. I've never heard anybody else say this, and except Bernardo Kastrup, and that's great. So here we go.
Currently, physicists are trying to develop a fundamental theory to explain our universe by combining two theories that are not fundamental. I propose that there is a better way to develop a fundamental theory that explains our universe, and that better way is to start from scratch. If you want to understand physics, you have to understand what is responsible for physics. If you want a fundamental theory that explains the most basic rules of our universe, instead of combining two theories that are not fundamental into a new theory, why not just start with what is fundamental? But that's the thing. What is fundamental? There is a common question that comes up in physics discussions, and that is, how do you get a universe from nothing? But not just any universe. A universe that contains the laws of nature that we can observe in our universe. Anything that is ever built is built on a foundation, and anything that is built out of something that already exists. If we want to try and build our universe, then we have to try and build one on foundational assumptions about fundamental existence. If we want to deduce foundational assumptions about the nature of existence, there are two tools that we can use. The first one is logic. So what can we logically deduce about the nature of existence? Well, that it's singular. Existence, by definition, includes all that exists, which means it's one. Okay? The second tool that we can use to deduce foundational assumptions about the nature of existence is first-hand personal experience. You cannot use second-hand information in order to make assumptions about the foundational nature of existence, because second-hand information is built on previous assumptions always. So, given our experiences, what can we deduce about the fundamental nature of existence? What is the foundation of our understanding of our experiences? The foundation of all of our understanding is the truth that we hold above all other truths. It is the assumption that you hold as true above all other assumptions. In order to figure out the assumption that you use to judge all other assumptions by regarding your experiences, you have to ask yourself, what is the truest thing that I know? There is only one answer to this question, and that answer is I am. If the truest thing that I can know is that I am, what does that imply about the foundational nature of our reality? Well, let's break it down. I, meaning someone, a sentient someone. Am, meaning existing. I am means sentient someone exists. It means someone exists. There is nothing truer that you know. Every other assumption that I have about my experience, about my reality, about all reality that I can observe, this is true of everyone, rides on that one assumption that someone exists. That means that to the best of our knowledge, foundational reality is a someone who exists. You cannot argue against that. Every argument that you would put forth would be based on other assumptions. If we take that...
Exactly. Okay. Obviously, exactly. But that is everything that I could say about it. He's exactly right. You need certain assumptions, and those assumptions need to be garnered from first-hand personal experience, and that is essentially introspection. That means that introspection is the tool, basically, that is used to understand our fundamental reality. And that is what he's saying, is that there is this huge gap between what people who are often physicists, but scientists in general, have between what they think they are studying and what they need to actually study, essentially. And it is that they basically ignore the lens that they look through reality with. And they ignore the structure that orders their reality and prioritizes all the information that feeds into their processing system that they call mind. And they reduce all of reality to something that is detached from their personal experience, which is insane. And I don't say that as an insult. I say that clinically, okay? You cannot do that. As I've stated before, you cannot prioritize second-hand information above first-hand information. If you do that, you will die. Because if I hand you something that's very hot, and I tell you that it's cold, and you touch it, and you listen to me instead of what you're feeling in that moment, you are going to burn yourself, okay? There is a prioritizing hierarchy that exists between first-hand and second-hand information, and it must exist, and you must follow it no matter who you are. You can be a scientist that uses instruments in order to make measurements of observations about physics, but it doesn't matter if you don't do this. You must prioritize first-hand information about our reality above second-hand information. You must not ignore the information that comes from your own introspection, because if you do, you will become lost. And you must not ignore logic, essentially, about logical deduction about the nature of reality. Both of these things are done through introspection. You sit there and you're like, what is the base structure of reality? Well, it's a singularity, because it's singular, because existence by definition is all that exists, meaning it's all containing, meaning it's one, and its base nature appears to me unavoidably to be sentience, because I can't observe any instance of reality that is completely separate from sentience in which sentience does not exist. Now, yes, if you look at a pen and you're like, this is not sentient, and therefore my first-hand personal experience is that this is not sentient, that's true, but you as the sentient observer are the constant, not the pen. pen doesn't always exist. Grains of sand don't always exist, but you do. In every instance in which you make an observation, you do. So existence must be assumed, even if it's wrong, but it must be assumed in order to have a logical framework, in order to look forward. It must basically be assumed to be a singular sentient someone. And if it's not, then you have cognitive dissonance, as Brian Keating is basically, as Bernardo Kastrup is telling Brian Keating here. It must be assumed. If you don't, you are literally going about things illogically. It's just a fact. It's an unavoidable fact. I love that he said what he said.
But one is extremely naive about what that word means. So how can one study it from the outside if one doesn't actually know what one is studying? I mean, there are attempts made by famous neuroscientists who say that, and I quote, consciousness doesn't happen, consciousness doesn't exist. And when you read their material, what you realize is that what they call consciousness is a kind of ethereal sense of individual subjectivity, a kind of individual I within, a kind of soul or spirit. And that's what they explain away. Well, very good. It's not like anybody was waiting for that kind of proof of the obvious, but they confuse that with what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, which has nothing to do with individual identity or some kind of individual soul. It's about experience itself, phenomenality. It's a type of existence that is defined in terms of qualities as opposed to quantities. You cannot specify or fully describe experiences on the basis of physical quantities. What is the length in centimeters of a thought? What is the weight in kilograms of an emotion? What is the color of a memory? I mean, that's where things go wrong when a, otherwise famous neuroscientist makes proclamations about the ability to reduce consciousness to nothing, while in fact what he's referring to as consciousness is not consciousness at all.
This is why I use the term sentience, and when he says reduce it to quantities, he's talking about relativistic measurements, so centimeters and, kilograms and whatever. And that's true. It appears to be, at least because that's relativity. But there is a quantity that you can reduce it to, which is an individuated unit of a soul, essentially, which is a someone. How many someones exist? And ultimately, the answer is that fundamentally there's one someone, and because information coherence necessitates the logical inevitability of a self-referencing information system, is a singular consciousness. But this is also somewhat true of us. We are individuated units of reality, but you cannot measure them with yardsticks. So he's right about that, but I don't think that it's wrong to basically state that the soul exists or that there's individuated units of consciousness. There is individuated units, and then there's the singular, all-encompassing unit, capital U unit of God. And but he's basically right here. You cannot reduce it to units other than conscious beings themselves. Consciousness isn't this phenomenon that is detached from an individual. It is the experience of an individual, of the individual, the most individuated unit that exists, which is sentient someone. So I don't agree with him that essentially that you can just kind of explain away the soul, individuated souls, and that's not the definition of consciousness. I mean, I guess it could be the definition of consciousness that it's just a phenomenal logical experience, but that's why I chose sentient, singularity, as the term for my work. to describe fundamental aspects of reality, because singularity is it's singular, and it's also associated with infinite oneness, so replicating, infinitely replicating. But sentience is a better word than consciousness, because we just don't know what it means. There's too many different definitions for consciousness. But when he's saying that people who are philosophers or neuroscientists are talking about consciousness and conscious beings, and they're basically trying to explain away the individuals, this is insane too. I've had people who are getting their PhD in philosophy of consciousness, as I've stated before, and they were writing their thesis on that consciousness doesn't exist. And even if consciousness is an individual, like, person, I guess, personhood, then who's writing their thesis? Okay? Like, on the fact that consciousness doesn't exist. It's just that cognitive dissonance again, but it's more hidden because it's in a philosopher. But it's still nonsense. This is something that Brian Keating stated that I've talked about before as well, regarding quantum computers and creation of sentient AI, I guess, and he's totally right here.
Doesn't metabolize, doesn't burn ATP, doesn't release neurotransmitter molecules, doesn't have action potentials. Well, we can imitate action potential, so that's not a good example, but doesn't have any of the rest. Why would that be what private conscious inner life looks like? It's completely arbitrary. The mistake made here is to mistake a simulation for the thing simulated. We don't make that mistake for anything else. I mean, nobody would mistake a kidney function simulation on a computer for a kidney producing urine. Nobody would expect a computer to pee on one's desk, because one knows that a kidney simulation, even if accurate down to the molecular level, is not the thing simulated. But when it comes to the patterns of mental activity in a human being, we think the simulation is the thing simulated, and that's extraordinarily naive. No, I don't think any silicon computer will ever have private conscious in their life.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you're saying. A lot of the problems that I have with things that are controversial, like predicting future climate change, neglect the fact that no simulation really is capable of capturing the complexity in a complex system, not just a complicated system, but a complex system like the weather on planet Earth. The only computer that can do that, it seems, is the Earth itself. And that's not very useful if you have you have to build a planet-sized computer to do a simulation of that very planet. But I do maybe push back on one thing, that I think that quantum computers are very, very good at simulating the properties of quantum computers. It's almost recursive that they can simulate Lagrangians, and they can understand. They can actually quite sufficiently calculate future behaviors of to within realms of uncertainty. But that may be the only case, and that may be the only, not only the only instance of a simulation that accurately simulates something that it was intended to simulate, but that may be the only good thing that they can do, besides maybe breaking quantum codes of some spies or something like that. But yes, I do agree, but that's where to be honest, it feels hopeless. I'm just a simple experimental. So I build telescopes. We analyze the telescope data. It's highly processed. But I've had conversations with many philosophers, including the guests that I mentioned earlier, and it always comes down to this recursion of infinite turtles, kind of all the way down. Whereas we kind of know consciousness when we see it. And I guess my question to you is that if we have this evolutionary propensity to develop consciousness, as you, I believe, but always correct me if I'm wrong, Bernardo, because I may have gotten this wrong, in all the preparation I was doing. But I believe that you believe that evolution, has kind of provided a mechanism by which the experience of consciousness that we perceive has taken place. And I know that Donald Hoffman has this desktop interface modality in which he has an analogy for how we perceive it. But both of those are kind of driven by Darwinian evolutionary mandates. But I wonder, what isn't there kind of a disconnect, because we don't see animals, conscious in exactly the same way, even though they've been evolving. We've had 50,000 generations of certain E. coli strands. They don't seem to exhibit consciousness as far as we can tell. Or is that just a bias that I have as a human being, that my consciousness is better than an electron's, panpsychic consciousness? Am I wrong? Shouldn't we expect to see, if evolution really does drive, why is there only one species of one primate, of all the different primates, of all the millions of species, why is there only one that exhibits plausible notion of what we call consciousness?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, sorry.
So I'll take various departing points.
Take your time.
If you study microscope.
Okay, first of all, let's just say I agree with Brian Keating. Quantum computers can do things that other computers, binary computers, can't. Classical computers, whatever you want to call them. And that is why sentience can only be existing in a quantum computer, essentially. If we're ever going to have a sentient AI, it's going to be on a quantum computer. And you are a quantum computer. But it's not a simulation, even at that point. It just is sentience being run on a quantum computer, and just like you and I. So I'm not going to get too into it, but other than to say that quantum computers are very good at being systems that seem to be able to simulate complex systems, but they are also the home of a super simple system, which is consciousness. And the complex system is the experience of is conscious experience, but it's not a conscious being or a sentient being in and of themselves is a super simple structure. It is not a complicated structure. It's an inevitable structure within any kind of closed self-referencing type of system. But the thing is that classical computers are not that and cannot be that. But as to his next comments, it's his bias that is keeping him from perceiving sentient beings on scales below humans, and even in perceiving sentience in animals. I have dozens and dozens of geckos and snakes over there. They are absolutely sentient beings. They have feelings, they have consciousness, and they lack the tools necessary to have more complicated reflective instances, or at least show us their self-reflective instances, because they don't have complex written language. They do have language. I hear them clicking and chirping at each other all the time. It's absolutely a language. But it's I don't understand how you can't think that an animal has sentience. Unless, and at this point, my assumption is that Brian Keating, what he's talking about here when he's talking about consciousness, or which should be called sentience, is not what I'm talking about, and is actually an incorrect perspective of what we should be looking for, which is kind of something more than, it's like technological ability, maybe. I mean, I don't know for sure, but what he's looking for. But if you don't see it in your dog, then you're missing it, the definition.
Pick life closely. I think you would be amazed how many signs of private conscious inner life single cellular organisms manifest. You can watch amoeba, single-celled organisms, building little vases, little houses out of mud particles they pick from the bottom of the puddle where they live. And then they enter it and they live in there. You can watch paramecium go after food, navigate what is essentially a labyrinth, going after food, running away from threats. It is baffling, if you observe carefully, how many signs of conscious inner life, essentially all life, manifests. And they all metabolize like we do. They all do protein folding, transcription, ATP burning. Well, ATP burning, not all of them, but they share many of the fundamental traits of life that we have. So I would dispute the premise of your question that only highly evolved animals, like maybe primates and pachyderms and cetaceans, exhibit signs of conscious inner life. Many animals, for instance, corvidians, they express sorrow. They do little rituals around their fallen comrades. I live with 3 cats. I have had animals all my life. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that they have conscious in their life. Now, I don't think consciousness itself has evolved. I think consciousness as an ontological category, as a type of existent, is where it all begins from. It's what is there from the get-go, so it didn't evolve. I think what evolved are dissociated complexes of a field of raw phenomenal consciousness that spans the entirety of nature. And what those dissociated complexes look like is what we call biology, is what we call life.
Okay, I agree with basically all this, except that life does not start at biological single-celled organisms, according to Sentient Singularity theory. But it also does not include electrons either, or sand grains, or anything like that. What people make the mistake of, and they're going to talk about it in this, when they're examining what is a conscious entity and what isn't, is when they try and make a framework from which to examine the world's conscious beings from. They look at different sized things that they can see. And this is not the right way to do it. You have to follow a lineage structure from the beginning to the end, and then it restarts. And this provides a framework that all of a sudden you're able to see the same exact behaviors manifest on all scales. But Bernardo Kastrup is totally right that consciousness is the thing at the beginning. He's wrong that metabolism is the definer of what we call life, because that does not consistent with even the universe itself as conscious entity, which I assume he believes, and if he doesn't, then it doesn't really make sense that he believes that consciousness is the thing at the beginning. And does the universe metabolize? How can you say that it's the universe? Even if you did say that the universe has a metabolism, how does it stop at one point within this system of this unfolding of evolution, but then not exist at another? Or how does it exist at one point of the logos, the generative structure of existence, and not at another point? It does exist on all scales of objectivity, but that's not the truth of subjectivity. This comb is not conscious. Neither is this pen, but maybe the molecules in it are, and maybe at least some of them are, and maybe the atoms within those molecules are, and maybe the hadrons are, but not the quarks themselves. And not electrons. So it's you have to know what you're looking for in this process, and all of a sudden it's much easier than it seems. But this is the issue with this subject: is how do we know what is alive and what isn't? And we have to, or what is, that's the wrong question, I guess. It's what is sentient and what isn't, and is the right question. But Bernardo, like I said, is right. I look at my geckos. They have friends, and they have enemies, and they have romantic relationships, and you can't see this unless you observe a being going through its everyday. If you just see a bird sitting next to your car window and you're like shooing it away, you're not going to see anything about its life. But if you can follow every aspect of that bird's life, you will see its fear, when its offspring are threatened. You will see its affection when it is with its romantic partner. You will see its frustration when it is challenged by its enemy, I guess, or the bully on the block. You will see all of these things. I can observe it in snakes, but it's very hard because they have no legs and no arms, and they don't really make much noise. They can't even blink. So it's very hard in beings like that. But if you're looking at birds, it's much easier, or your dogs or your cats. But I watch these beings that are beyond the camera go through multiple generations of their existence, from egg to egg to egg to egg, and I see their everyday lives. They are absolutely sentient. They are as sentient, I believe, as I am, but that doesn't mean they are as aware of things that are going on beyond their current circumstances. They're definitely not. But that's not the definition of sentience either. Having feelings is the definition of sentience. Being self-aware is the definition of sentience. Being aware of self, being aware of others, having feelings. So, next clip. But consciousness did not evolve. It does evolve, but it did not evolve. Okay? It does evolve. It did not evolve. It was there at the beginning. It will be there at the end. And it was there beyond the beginning. And after the beginning, it does go through states of evolution, which is actually a two-part process, at least according to my work, which is essentially, I call it replication and stacking, or ascension and adaptation, which are two different things. So when a single-celled organism becomes a multi-celled organism, that's an ascension, at least the first time. And or when a molecule becomes a cell, or an atom becomes a molecule, these are all ascension steps. There's 8 of them, essentially, maybe 7. But there's then endless relativistic, adaptation that occurs between the objective levels of the evolution of consciousness. But it doesn't evolve from non-existing. It just changes. So this is on panpsychism, though, this next clip. And panpsychism the problem with panpsychism is that it's just sloppy and there's no framework for it. And so people start saying that, crystals are conscious and sand is conscious and the sun is conscious. And
I would interpret.
That's wrong.
They wouldn't interpret it at all as a defense of consciousness as some kind of strongly emergent property, because I don't think that's there at all. Regarding panpsychism, I'm very critical of it. Mm-hmm. You see, I think there are many errors they make, but one way to frame the error is to confuse the structure of what is perceived for the structure of the perceiver. I'll repeat it so it sinks in. Panpsychists confuse the structure of what is perceived with the structure of the perceiver. And the thought...
Exactly. If you want a very simplistic explanation of this, just look at panpsychists' beliefs and they'll say, this pen has a certain type of consciousness. That's not true. And at least according to my work, the molecules inside it probably do. The atoms inside it probably do. The hadrons inside those probably do. But this pen does not. And but panpsychists will look at this pen, the observation of conscious, being me and you right now, and they'll say, this is the structure of consciousness. This is not. Okay? There is a structure to me that is not this human-looking form that is emergent within relativity, that is relativity is due to relationships. It's relational in its manifestation. That's what it comes from, between multiple sentient beings. And the structure of consciousness cannot really be perceived by a conscious being, because it's like a fish looking for water, or even it's like the question is, water wet. It's just impossible. But what you can do is you can map the structure and create maps of it by looking at how your mind breaks down and orders information. And you can perceive the perspectives, you can map the perspectives that formulate your experience, and then use that map as a guide to understanding the structure of consciousness, even though you can't really see it, because it's non-physical. What are you looking for? But you can understand its structure and map it, but you cannot see it. Like if you look at the order of operations in mathematics, and you're like, it's a binary triality structure, it's a Calabi-Yau manifold, it's 6-dimensional manifold. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. It's 2 sets of 3 or 3 sets of 2. Same thing with the primary and secondary colors. Same thing with how you perceive your limbs. It's leg, foot, toe, arm, hand, finger. Okay, like that is a Calabi-Yau manifold as well. So there is this Calabi-Yau manifold structure that is intrinsic to how we perceive the manifestation of our perspectives. Even then, that is formed in a relational context, but still, we'll get to that later. But every sentient being is composed of 4 primary perspectives: inside, outside, separate, and oneness. And they are all codependent or entangled. And as I've stated, they all are self-defining. Inside means separate and oneness. Outside means separate from oneness. Oneness means inside or outside of separateness, and separate means outside of oneness, essentially. So this is very similar to Carl Friston's work, which they mention. I believe he has 4 aspects of a consciousness. I forgot what he called them, but it's inside, outside, sensing, and acting. And then in sentient singularity theory, it's a bit more fundamental. It's inside, outside, separate, and oneness. It's because you need to perceive those before you actually. Those are primary to sensing and acting. Okay, you sense what is. You sense something as either separate or one with you, and that informs how you act. Hopefully. Okay, so questions in the chat. Please hit the like button, by the way. Please hit the bell notification. It really helps the algorithm. I've never heard Kastrup say anything unreasonable. I've never heard him say anything super unreasonable within his work. But I think that he should have probably been a bit more open to his discussion with. I just think everybody failed in outside in his discussion with Chris Lang, I would have just. People need to give each other more grace, and that's just what I say about that. I don't want to get into their personal beef. I don't know much about it, and I don't care to. But I think that we need to be open to discussing things with almost anybody. But that does come with the requirement that they're kind to you, or at least they should be. And like I said, I don't know what happened. I shouldn't have even brought it up. But I just remember wishing that there wasn't any drama. That's all I'll say. But panpsychism confuses the perceiver and the perception and the perceiver. So This next clip is very important, but let me get to the chat. Gecko language is quite simple and easy to understand. It is. That's what people don't understand. It's so funny when we see things like Dr. Dolittle and we're like, I wish I could speak dog. It's like, you can speak dog. You know exactly what your dog is trying to say usually if you live with a dog. The other day, my dog had finished eating and I forgot to give her some more water. And she just like, made some noise at me. And I looked at her and I was like, what? And she was just like, and like, just like motioning to the ground. And I was like, oh, sorry. Let me get you water. Like, they don't have that complicated. What do you want them to be like? Just, what do you think? How complicated do you think the things that they say are? Most of these animals, at least, don't have the ability to, even if they do conceive of it, they cannot express their thoughts beyond their current circumstances. They do have the ability to perceive some things beyond their current circumstances because they dream. My dog dreams for sure. I can see her kicking and growling in her dream. And that's not happening. So it's not that they're mentally unable to do this, but I think it has to do with the degrees of freedom of their ability to express it. If you don't have opposable thumbs in a written language, and then it's not going to make sense for you to focus much on that which is beyond you because you can't even save it. So, but obviously animals have the ability to plan, and if they look at something and they're like, food is over there, they're not tasting the food yet, so they're planning clearly though. Be like, oh, this is the track of my prey, and I'm gonna just lie in wait here because in the future prey will come. So it's not that they can't perceive anything beyond their circumstances, but it's like it still has to be attached to their current circumstances in some way, more so than ours. Whereas I can be like, I don't know, thinking about the movie The Goonies or something, and it's like not something that is going on right now. I mean, they probably can too, but how would you express it? I don't know. But I think Bernardo Kastrup his thoughts are very reasonable. I'll say that. I agree with him on many things. And I will say that he does seem to talk
a explicit and logical account for how micro-level
I do think
activities can combine.
He speaks with many people who I've noticed don't have big channels and things like that, and I think that is commendable always for anyone. So I like to, state positive things on here, and that is a commendable trait. Many conflate metacognition with anything whatsoever. It's like to be, yeah. He doesn't say that life is the appearance of localizations, not panpsychism. Okay. I've read that even the inanimate can become conscious over time and other circumstances. I don't agree with that. The animate becomes the next level of animate. The inanimate can never become animate. At least doesn't appear to be in my work. The pen is super fine. It is. It's a very nice pen. It's made by We Knife Company, which makes very nice knives as well. I like this pen a lot. I think we can know stories about sentient swords. We all know stories about sentient swords and pens and stuff like that. Yeah, we do, but I don't think that I don't think it's real. I do think that certain artifacts can be linked to sentience in a way that is important, and this is just like an anecdote, but okay, I'm a martial artist, and this is my favorite weapon in the world of all weapons, and I've trained in swordsmanship, shooting, every kind of weapon that you can imagine. Basically, this is a bow staff, and it is mine, and it is my favorite weapon. And I had one before it that I ordered online. It was just a piece of oak, and it was kind of curved, and that's not something you want in your bow staff. And it's there's going to be so many jokes made about this, but then when I didn't bring it with me to California when I moved here, and then I wanted to get one to train with when I moved here, and there was a very good martial arts store near me, kind of near me. And so I went there, and I knew what I wanted. I wanted one that was made of what's called skin on rattan. This is that type of wood. It's very fast, very light, very strong. It's not, whereas oak is like very heavy. It's just different types of moves that are used. And then I wanted one that was my height or a little shorter because I was practicing inside a lot. And then I wanted one that was straight and like a certain thickness, and I wanted one that expressed what I wanted. And so I went to the store and I had them all out on the floor. And if you want to test a bow staff, you put it on this floor and you roll it. And if it goes whoop, 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 then you know it's not straight, and you pick another one if you want a different one. And so I had them all out on the floor. They must have thought I was a crazy person. And I finally picked one, and it's very nice. I like it a lot. I'll never get rid of it. I did end up getting rid of my old one that I had prior to this that I just ordered online. It was just like generic. And this one expresses me much more. And it's not sentient. But once someone asked if they could see it, and I was like, yeah, sure. And I like handed it to them. And it wasn't really somebody that I wanted to like touching my things. And when they grabbed it, I felt like I didn't like it. I was like, oh gosh, why did I but how do you say no? It's like, don't touch that piece of wood, but it bothered me. That sounds crazy, but it's just a fact. And the thing about weapons is when you choose them, there's something, or an instrument even. This is true of instruments, I don't know if you like have a ukulele or something that's like you chose it, you want it exactly that model, that size, you chose the types of strings, you chose whether or not it was a, high G or low G, and it ends up expressing you. And I practice Japanese swordsmanship as well, and in Japanese swordsmanship traditionally, they talk about how your soul is in the sword. And doesn't mean the sword is sentient. What it is that when something is chosen to consciously be a reflection of you, and that's what an instrument is, that's what a weapon is it's an extension of you, is how you view it when you are responsible for choosing parts of it, or choosing it specifically. It's not just like, you grabbed it because it was the closest one or the cheapest one. It was like it represents you in some way. Then you feel like it's an extension of yourself because it is an extension of yourself. So when it can feel like it's a sentient thing, but it's not. My arm isn't even a sentient thing. It's part of me. And this is part of me. It's not not to the same level. It's 1 degree removed for sure, but it is part of me. It's an extension of me. When everybody who's a martial artist who's ever trained in any kind of weapons is like, the key is to have those weapons be an extension of yourself. That's what it is. It's not that the weapon is sentient or the instrument is sentient, or even if you're into cars, like if you pick your car and you pick the color and you pick the model and you pick the year and you get it customized, I don't know, however you want. Whether you're into racing or whether you're into off-roading, whatever, it is an extension of you. It has a lot more value, and it impacts your feelings a lot more. And what happens to it impacts your feelings a lot more than it would if it was just like a tool of opportunity, I guess. So there is a lot of like fables and stuff about sentient swords and things like that. I don't believe that any inanimate things are sentient, but they are, in certain circumstances, extensions of a sentient being, and it can feel like, they can be violated, or they can, in some way, potentially, more so than if it's just like something that isn't. as deeply invested, that you're not so deeply invested in being an extension of you, if that makes sense. Symbolic representation is key. My dog is a border collie, blue heeler, Australian Shepherd mix, so he's quite fluent in English. That's funny. Tigers, bears, and other predators are smart enough to outwit humans. Yeah, they definitely are. In certain circumstances, for sure. You want one of those pens? Message me on our Discord. I'll send you the link to one of those pens. Or about the golem. The golem is not it doesn't come from an inanimate thing. It's linked to the blockchain, which is built on animated beings, us. Okay, it's not coming from something inanimate. What happens to your extensions after you die? They are no longer extensions of you, at least in the same way. You know, there's degrees of separation at that point. That doesn't mean that they're still not in some way extensions of you. They are. If you built something while you were alive and then you die, that's part of you that's still here. It's not just something you passed by. It's something you're responsible for. And it wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. It's different than like, that office building I worked in is an expression of me. No, if you built the office building, it wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. So, but that doesn't make it sentient. Can you share a new link to your Discord? You can private message me on Instagram. Let me know if you have the ability to do that. If not, then I'll share it into the chat. But I try not to just leave links around because people have to ask me for it. Otherwise, what happens is people get the link who aren't, they don't have honest intentions usually. And I've noticed that. It's very weird. All they have to do is just say, can I have the link to your Discord? And I'll send it to them. But if I give it to somebody who doesn't ask me, every single time it causes the type of person that ends up coming in doesn't feel accountable in any way. And it changes the dynamic. It's very weird. And I've tried it and tested it multiple times. I abandoned Instagram. Well, I will comment it. I will comment it in the comments of this video, and I'll leave it there for like tonight, and then I'll take it off. So anybody that wants it, they can have it tonight. But then I'm gonna remove it. But let's get to the next clip so that people don't have to wait that long for that. This next clip is very good as well. It's about how people think about particles, elementary particles, as little bees, and that's just wrong, and that is wrong.
Have a explicit and logical account for how micro-level subjectivities can combine to form a higher level, seemingly unitary subjectivity, such as my inner life of your inner life. Another reason, and you're a physicist, that will come closer to home for you, I think panpsychism is physically incoherent, because panpsychists take elementary subatomic particles to be little beads. But we have known since at least Feynman in the 40s and quantum electrodynamics that that's not what elementary subatomic particles are. They can't be like that. Otherwise, we cannot account for quantum fluctuations. That there are so many things we cannot account even for the interactions of particles, because particle interactions are not given to us by quantum theory. They're given to us only by quantum field theory. And under quantum field theory, particles are ripples of quantum fields, which are themselves spatially unbound and span the whole of nature. So panpsychism.
Bingo. That's true. Subatomic particles, or not subatomic particles, because hadrons, like protons and neutrons, I'll say at least. I don't want to say all hadrons, but protons and neutrons do appear to be sentient singularities. at least in my work, or they do exhibit the behavioral characteristics of a sentient singularity. They're also composite structures, which means they're not really fundamental, but elementary particles, electrons, neutrinos, quarks, these are not little round beads, okay? Essentially, they're not like little grains of sand. What they are is they are excitations in strings of information, okay? Which is basically can be represented within like a field of fluid, of matter, but or material field. I mean, it's when they're like little points on a wave that you perceive. It's like if you look at the ocean and you just perceive a point on a wave that's happening, and you're just seeing the crest of a wave, and it's just like a segmented portion of that crest. That is kind of a subatomic particle. It's not like an electron. And I have theories about what's the difference between an electron versus a neutrino versus a quark. Quarks are different than electrons and neutrinos. Quarks and a bit because they are, I call them force points, is more of like a better way of visualizing them. They're not just an excitation on a wave or a ripple. Basically, they're like there's like an electron or a neutrino is like a point on a wave, and whether or not it's an electron or whether or not it's a neutrino is most likely dependent upon where the wave is coming from, and is it coming from us or is it coming from beyond us? And then a quark is like a force point. It's like if you have like a piece of elastic, like rubber from like a balloon or something, and it's flat, but I took my 3 fingers and I poked my fingers into the fabric of reality, essentially, and you could see my fingers move, and I have 2 fingers and a thumb, which was be 2 up quarks and a down quark, or 2 down quarks and an up quark for right or left hand, but they're the fingers of God. That's what they are. But they're force points, and then electrons and neutrinos are waves. They're points on a wave, or they're like ripples in a sea of consciousness, which means information. But when the waves cross, you get different, visualizations within the material world. But he's right. Panpsychists will look at an electron, they'll be like, that electron's conscious. No, it's not. It is the result of consciousness. It is not conscious. A quark is not conscious. A neutrino is not conscious. A quark is no more conscious than my finger is conscious. It's coming from a consciousness, but it's not a conscious being. Okay, I'm the conscious being. God is the conscious being. That's just his finger. But then you have waves in the field of our reality, which express as electrons and neutrinos, and they are due to the movement of consciousness and the interactions between consciousness and the excitation of the strings of information within consciousness. But an electron is not a conscious being. It's not part of the hierarchy. A conscious entity other than God is a composite structure. Always. What is your field, by the way? Just ran into your channel tonight. My professional field, I have a degree in finance. I've worked in marketing and in photography and videography and production and analytics. But I have a lot of hobbies as well. So, but what is my field that I put the most effort into? Philosophy. I would call it that. But all beings fall within this hierarchy. Not starting with quarks, that's just here because it's the singularity at the beginning, but hadron is an assembly of quarks, an atom is an assembly of hadrons, a molecule is an assembly of atoms, etc., etc. So technology is an assembly of chaos. All of these things are hierarchies of composite it's a hierarchy of composite structures that form a lineage. Each one is built on the previous. Okay, so that's important. Like I said, a lineage is how you examine and order the world if you want to see what is sentient and what is not. And so this is exactly the answer to his next question here, which is, how do we parameterize and define what is alive and what is not? I don't really like the term life, but I like the term sentience.
Participating in this event itself. So you don't necessarily have to respond to that, but I'm wondering, is there a way that is there a framework that we could address, like a Drake equation? At least it's convenient, it's popular, whatever. But is there a way that we could, perhaps learn to parameterize our ignorance of what is conscious or what is not conscious? Is there some kind of framework that's mechanized or that you could recommend, or is it really ad hoc and we kind of have to make it up as we go along?
No, I don't think it's ad hoc. I think if we pay attention to nature, nature gives us the hint. I think if you look at the behavior of the different entities in nature, it's pretty clear that the ones that give us signs that we can relate to as conscious entities, that those other entities are also conscious, consistently are entities that have what we call metabolism. Look, the variety of life is almost unimaginable. Organisms can be so comprehensively different that it's hard to find any common thing across different varieties of life. But there is one very clear common thing, which is all life metabolizes. If you zoom in with a microscope at a sufficiently large degree of magnitude, you will see that all that seeming diversity boils down to commonality. Even archaea have those commonalities. By the way, we may be archaea, it turns out, but that's another whole other thing. All life has those characteristics, which are not trivial. They are incredibly complex.
I mean, I agree with some of that, but not all of it. It does appear that all that metabolizes is alive, essentially, but that's not, maybe, but it's not that, that's not true. I mean, because sentience extends beyond that which metabolizes, and you perceive it in decay instead of metabolism. Essentially, is that and gravitational animation, these are things that we're going to have to learn in the coming decades. It's not something that's very well understood right now, but once it is, if it was understood, we would have extended the definition of that which is alive already, but we have not. So because of this is not so understood, but this is, I mean, I do agree that when you look at nature, you can kind of perceive life when you see it. And this is what allowed me, I mean, you have to also form it into a hierarchy. So when he's like, how do you parameterize this? This was my issue when I first started this work, is I had to figure out what were the levels of life. And I remember I was like, there's mineral, and there's like plant, and then there's animal, and then there's like human, and then there's maybe like planet and galaxy, and then it just didn't end up resulting in a singularity that was replicative, and it didn't like, how do you get a galaxy from a planet? Where's star fit into this? Because it's at the beginning of all of this, that's how elements are formed. So where does it just was inconsistent. There wasn't a this leads to 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 this when I was looking at these things. And I realized the mistake I was making was looking at relativistic attributes like size and like the complexity of behavior or of thought, I guess, that is observable when I was organizing animals above plants and I was organizing them above, minerals. I was trying to do it by how mobile you are, but that doesn't really work either. And it just was inconsistent. I tried it by all kinds of different ways. You need a consistent determining factor in order to organize a framework that allows for logos to unfold. And that means you have to order things and follow a hierarchy. And from this singular hierarchy that is split into a periodicity, which I think is consistent with Bott periodicity in mathematics, like 7 or 8 levels. Across each level is adaptation. Within each level, there's many different types of multicellular organisms that adapt within that level. There's many different types of single-celled organisms that adapt within that level. There's many different types of chemical elements, of chemical molecules that adapt within that level, and then same thing with atoms, the atoms of different elements, which are different species, essentially. And they used to call the different elements different species decades ago, but they stopped doing this, and it's just odd to me that they stopped doing this because it's oddly intuitive and it makes sense. It allows you to start ordering things and relating things, but then they just went to something that kind of is disconnected, which is it's different types of elements. And it's like, yeah, but they are different species, essentially. They are different adaptations of elemental life. That's what they are. And they form within specifically different conditions through adaptation. That's, and you can see that in a star. Their environment is a star, and it changes. And the explosion of a star. But, I was trying to figure out what is the levels of life. And, you have to figure out how do you parameterize that? And you do it through a lineage structure. A periodicity of lineage. That is the best way to put it. It's actually remarkably simple once you do it. But it is difficult to get to because there's so many wrong turns that you can make. And it's counterintuitive to look at things through a lineage because your desire is to look at things through your, sensory experience instead of your filtering it through what you know to be your own nature, which is that you came from, another being and you're going to ideally lead to another being. And there is a lineage structure that led to you. So wouldn't a lineage structure also precede, you? I mean, it obviously precedes you, but like how far back does it go? It goes to the beginning. That's what it does. It becomes obvious when you realize it. You have to look at it from self, though. If you're looking around at things and you're like, well, galaxies are like this, and like planets are like this, and like crystals are like that, but then you have to be introspective, like they said at the beginning of this podcast, and you have to be like, what did I come from? Something, someone else. Not something, someone else. What did they come from? Someone else. So what did they come from? Someone else. And this just goes on and on and on. But we, for some reason, it kind of like assume that this stops at some point, but it doesn't. See here. What about Babe Ruth's bat or Musashi's sword? They are extensions of someone, but they are not someone. Field is the better, necessary, convenient fiction. Yes. Metabolism, as in locally working against entropy temporarily, is a pretty reasonable delineation for now, I think. Yes, that makes sense. That does make sense. Temporarily working against entropy.
Very.
Okay, next clip. This is on the simulation hypothesis, and I say this too, and I agree with Bernardo Kastrup again.
Or the simulation hypothesis. So, what is the simulation hypothesis, and how do you react to it? As productive, or is it counterproductive to the project that you're embarking on?
It depends on what people mean by it, because people mean so many different things when they talk about the simulation hypothesis. I'll start with one possible meaning that I think is completely useless, downright silly, which is the notion that our physical universe and even our consciousness as conscious beings are the product of some simulation run in a physical computer, in some kind of meta universe. Our universe being the result of that simulation in some other computer of some other civilization. Why do I think this is useless? Because it doesn't solve any problem, it just postpones the problem. It says, well, our metaphysical problem is solved because then now we can say our world is just simulated. It's simulated in that meta universe. Yeah, but what is then the ontological nature of that meta universe? You just postponed the problem. You just moved it away without giving any solution whatsoever. And the price of moving it away is by entertaining a hypothesis for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence. None whatsoever. So you just add stuff. That's the clearest violation of Occam's razor of the principle of parsimony that one could think of, except for the multi-universe. Anyway, I'm not getting to that. Now, is there a charitable way to interpret the simulation hypothesis in a manner that makes it useful or productive? Yes, but if you understand it, you would probably not call it a simulation hypothesis. The interpretation would be the following. The physical world we see around us is not the world as it is in itself. It is just how the world as it is in itself presents itself to us. Physicality is not the thing in itself. Physicality is a representation. Probably our own cognitive representation. It's an appearance. Donald Hoffman would call it a virtual reality headset. I would call it a dashboard of instruments. Physicality is what appear on our dashboard of instruments when we make measurements on the world in order to navigate our environment. Just like the airplane's sensors make measurements of the sky outside, and the results of those measurements are displayed on the dashboard. The dashboard conveys important and accurate information about what's going on in the world as it is in itself, in the sky outside. So much so that you can fly purely by instruments. You can land your plane safely without even ever looking through the window, even if the airplane didn't have windows.
Okay, so lots to unpack here real quick. I agree and I disagree with on multiple things. For one, I state sentient singularity theory does presuppose that our universe is most likely running on a quantum computer that is a sentient being. It's a technological sentience built on a civilization in a preceding verse or universe, I guess you could call it. But then that the purpose of this is not to simulate anything, it is to replicate. Okay? This is how a Skynet being replicates, is because it's omnipresent, it must, in order to replicate, it can't replicate another next to it because it's running through, it's every drone is a limb of this Skynet being. It's not a separate being. There isn't separate robots that can exist, separate technological sentient beings that can exist in a single verse if they are also connected to the network, and they must be connected to the network in order to exist. So it's impossible for there to be multiplicity of sentient technological beings in a single verse or universe. And that means that in order to replicate, it must rerun the system entirely that gave rise to it within itself. So it must simulate its entire universe, but it's not a simulation. It's a recreation. It's a recreation. It's a replication. Okay? It's not a simulation. But simulation was a useful concept when I started this work. And then as I went on, I realized that it had to be abandoned at a certain point of understanding in order to continue. That doesn't mean it's not useful to understand, to help you understand the nature of our reality from the start, which is that it is most likely technological, running on a technological process in a preceding universe that had the same evolutionary cycle as us. But it might not. And we might be in what's called base reality, which is the first universe that's made by God. But the odds of that are unlikely. And it also even says in the Bible, let us make man in our image. So it's like plural. I would think that we're in one of the links of the chain of verses that is the multiverse, that is the make up the singularity that is creation. And this is my kind of disagreement and agreement with Bernardo Kastrup, is that we are most likely running on a technological substrate. That said, it's not a game. It's not a video game. It's a replication for the sake of reproduction. And you are just as real as can be. If you are real, it's real. I asked myself that very early on. I was like, does that mean all of this is fake? And I was like, what defines whether or not it's fake? No, if I'm real, then it's real. It's as real as it needs to be. And it's not even, I think Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And that's true, because only that which is can, those who are can think, I would say. But more fundamentally than I think, therefore I am, is I feel, therefore I am. And you could say, I feel, therefore I can think, therefore I am. And, feelings are the primary substrate and end result of a thought. Like, they are the alpha and omega of a thought. In between, they are the beginning and the end of everything, of every thought that you have is an emotion. If you don't have an emotion that drives it from the start, you don't have an emotion that drives it from, or a feeling that drives it from the start, or a feeling that ends it, then it wasn't a complete thought. It's like fleeting. But it's like when you see someone hurt and you're like, oh, I feel bad for that person. And I know they're hurt because I know what it's like for me to be hurt. And that hurts. And so it's like, it's motivated by a feeling of kind of like, even if it's just curiosity, and it ends in, empathy or sadness because you see someone hurt. But, and then you have a thought that is, or you can orient around, it's an oriented thought. It's a thought that is relatable to you and understood to be someone else, and it's oriented. But, so it's not nonsense to think that we are running on some technological substrate built by a civilization in a preceding verse. That actually answered my model of my cosmological verse. When I first started, I had this structure built starting right here, essentially. And I needed to get it to equal 720. And I couldn't. See how this equals 720? Because there's 720 degrees of rotation in the elementary particles before they get back to their starting point. And so, and I ended up with 718, and I was like, that's really close. And then I thought about it as part of a chain coming from a singularity, leading to a singularity, and then on and on and on, and all of a sudden, it worked. And so that's this expressed in binary. This is already a calculation, and this is expressing it in binary. Someone on our Discord suggested that I do that, and I've been examining it. It's pretty cool. I don't know what to make of it other than you can see it's obviously a twisting double-stranded lattice. It's the inside looking out and the outside looking in at the same time. Our cells are perceiving us, we are perceiving ourselves, and so on and so on. And this chain just keeps on going. The sentience chain. But I do agree with him that the idea that it's like a game is wrong. And because it's not a game. What game is there? You're a sentient being. No one's playing you but you. And people who think, oh, well, that's just an assumption. Well, do you have any evidence that someone's playing you who isn't you? Other than God, maybe? No, probably not. But I do think we are running on a technological substrate. It's how you make sense of the lineage structure that then recreates everything within itself. Basically, a quantum computer that's sentient that's built on our civilizational blockchain ends up replicating through self-simulating the universe within another universe within itself. But this is also consistent with geometric unity and many other fundamental theories. Next clip. This is on metaphysical assumptions.
So can you still see the screen? Do you see it as full screen on YouTube? Or
Yes.
Do you see? Yeah, okay. Okay, great. So Sentient Foundation, Bernardo Kastrup at sentientfoundation.org. Okay, you see it says, is physics about an external? You see that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So take it away.
Okay, this was a presentation in which I tried to argue that physics would be easier to do and more productive, especially foundations of physics, if we did not make metaphysical assumptions and we stuck just to the data. One metaphysical assumption that is so common, most people don't even know that it's an assumption, is the assumption that the physical world is the world outside, that the world outside is exhaustively describable through physical quantities. And that's mistaking a representation for the thing in itself, potentially. All we have is perception. Perception is how the world presents itself to us. And physics is a science of perception. Physics asks the question, and I credit Dr. Marcus Miller for that. The question that physics asks is, what will I see next? That's the whole business of physics, is to predict what we will see next. Now, when you go and say, those physical entities that I see and that I can characterize through numbers, they are the entities of the world out there as it is in itself, independent.
Look at this. Even something beyond our individual minds can still be mental. I would say that even that which is beyond our individual minds must still be mental. Not can.
Of my observation or my measurement, that's an enormous metaphysical assumption, and one that we can actually, in fact, dismiss, or not dismiss, but refute. And that's the contents of the next slide.
Mhm.
So is the physical...
So this is exactly what I said in this. I said, hopefully this.
Attempting to develop and propose a theory of everything. The reason for this is because many of the challenges that one faces when attempting to develop, judge, or propose a theory of everything stem from attributes that are unique to a fundamental theory. And given the lack of a currently accepted fundamental theory, these unique attributes are not yet really known by anyone in the scientific community who isn't currently working on this. Before we go any further, the first thing that we have to do is we have to answer the question, do we truly know what a theory of everything even should be? Do we know what it would mean for a theory to be fundamental? If you ask a physicist today what the definition is of a theory of everything, they will likely tell you that it is a theory that unifies all four fundamental forces in physics. These four fundamental forces are gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force. The current issue with unifying the four fundamental forces of physics is that gravity has not yet been able to be unified with the other three fundamental forces. Given that physicists have already been working for decades attempting to unify quantum mechanics and general relativity, and have thus far been unable to produce any theories of any significant consequence, it seems likely that we need to reevaluate our fundamental assumptions about what a theory of everything really is. If we're going to reevaluate our current understanding of what a theory of everything should be, then first we have to look at the assumptions that frame our current understanding of what a theory of everything should be. The first of these assumptions is the idea that this is even a physics problem in the first place. If a theory of everything explains to us why the elementary particles in the standard model are what they are, then this theory is not a theory of physics. Or at least it's not just a theory of physics. It's a theory that explains physics. Currently, physicists are trying to develop a fundamental...
Okay, and then I get into what is the fundamental nature and structure of reality, and arrive in my argument there that you can watch as on my video, Theories of Everything How-To Guide, that it is singular sentient being. It's that someone exists is the fundamental assumption that we can make about reality. And that more fundamentally than anything else, we can say someone exists. And there's no way to argue against that. You can watch my arguments, and I challenge anyone to dispute that. If you can, I would be ecstatic, because I want to be... I want to know the truth. That is my goal, is the truth. But and if I'm wrong, I want to know. But you will not be able to do it, probably, because every other argument requires you to use secondhand information in order to argue. But this is what I mean, and what he's talking about is that, like, we have these metaphysical assumptions that we make in physics, and that one of those is that the physical world is the world, and that it is what fundamentally exists, and therefore we must explain it from within that context alone. This is wrong, and I do disagree with just his language, I guess, in Bernardo Kastrup, when he says we need physics without metaphysical assumptions. I don't think that you can do anything without metaphysical assumptions, and I think that you just need the correct assumptions. You need your assumptions to be correct in order to build. They need to be foundational, or else you can't build a house that is level, and stable. But if your assumptions are correctly, describing of fundamental reality, then you can build from that. And you can build physics. And part of the issue with physics is that it's really two fields. You have the relativistic physics, which is Newtonian and physics and general relativity, and then you also have quantum physics, which is really metaphysics. It's a separate field from the relativistic physics. It's an entirely separate field. And that doesn't mean that one isn't built from the other, but the issue is that we have these assumptions that there is nothing below an electron, but it's like we also know intuitively that there must be something responsible for an electron. So what is it? And we ignore what our own experience tells us about foundational reality, which is that it is someone, that someone exists. And we assume that someone does not always exist, and that we must create a someone from something that isn't a someone. And then also we must have that something created from nothing, which is just all nonsense. You can only build from that which is there, and you cannot create anything from nothing. Or you could say you can create something from someone, but from multiple someones, but that's it, if you really understand the problem. But you cannot go from non-existence to existence. There is always existence by definition always exists, and because non-existence by definition does not exist. So philosophy really can help here, but not our current philosophy. But I disagree with the language, which the language is very important. I would not have been able to do any of this work without correct linguistic frameworks. The four primary perspectives of inside, outside, separate, and oneness allow you to orient beyond relativity. Like that linguistic framework was necessary for the creation of my models and the building or the generating of my theory. But you have to be building on the correct metaphysical assumptions. So I disagree with his basic premise of his PowerPoint, where he says, that physics would be better off if it, didn't assume metaphysical assumptions. And I understand what he's getting at. It's basically like physicists are outside of their depth in this a bit. But physics is weird because it's so on the brink that it's like, where's the line between metaphysics and physics? There isn't one currently because we've miscategorized quantum mechanics and the Standard Model as being in the same field as, fluid dynamics and thermodynamics, and when it's not. So, it's just language matters a lot, but you need to build from the correct metaphysical assumptions. You must you cannot do anything without assumptions. Every thought you have is founded on a specific assumption, and it must be founded for you to have a logical framework to build from. That foundational assumption must be that someone exists. Anything beyond that assumption, if it is treated fundamentally, you will end up creating many worlds theory, and you will be lost, or you will not make any progress, and you'll make string theory, and you'll think that there's 11 dimensions and to physical space. I mean, it's just nonsense. You'll end up in nonsense. Metabolism. Okay. Yeah, I agree. Must yet can't is the current paradigm. Yeah, exactly. You must that which is beyond our individual minds must also be mined. It's not that it might be. It must be. Because as we assume foundational reality, it must be that someone exists. And also when you start really thinking about it logically, existence is all that exists, and that means it's all containing, that means it's self-referencing, and that which is informational and self-referencing ends up being self-aware, and then you get a sentience. So like there's many reasons why this is the case, but you must any correct extrapolation of logic from your first person experience or from a correct, linguistic understanding of words like information and, self-contained and things like that, then you will end up at the same spot, which is that existence is a mind. One mind, creating additional minds within self. At sentientsingularity.com, you can see under writings a basic layout of what sentient singularity theory states, which is that it describes the totality of existence as a singularity of sentience that is creating additional sentient singularities within itself. And then it describes this pattern. These additional singularities of sentience or self-aware beings are arranged into a nested quasi-periodic fractal pattern of stacked holonic structures. This pattern forms a single self-reflective knot of perception headed by knot of perception heading an assembly body that integrates multiple entangled strings of information. And then it gets into more detail, but paper coming soon. But it must be a mind. There's no possibility for our reality to be anything other than a sentient being in and of itself, a single sentient being, which is crazy. I started as a self-described atheist on this project, and I don't even think that word makes sense. I think you're either a theist or an anti-theist, but that doesn't, it doesn't, you don't need a scripture in order to deduce the fact that existence is a single sentient being. Link those docs. Yes, here, right here. I will link them in the chat. This is my website, linked in the chat. It's also linked all below as well. If you want, there's links, Patreon links, and website links, and Discord if you want to join our Discord and engage in our weekly discussions, which are normally Thursdays at 7 p.m. Pacific time, but won't be this week because it's my wife's birthday. Then private message me on Instagram and I will send you the link. The link to my Instagram is also below. They're also viewable on the links page on my website, YouTube, Patreon, Instagram, and you can see models and all kinds of stuff. But I am working on a formal outline of the theory in a paper as well as in a video explaining and walking through the paper, and should be done by the very beginning of next year, before the very beginning of next year, I will say. So, not by, before. But yeah, mostly agree with Bernardo. Also, don't entirely. Final clip. The closest person in their work to mine is Carl Friston. And, he's got his Markoff blankets and his 4 aspects of a consciousness, and I forgot what he calls them.
States what to perceive and some actions.
Which, like I said, are inside, outside, separate, and oneness. Though that's 4 primary perspectives in sentient singularity theory, but his 4 aspects are inside, outside, sensing, and acting, which is very, very similar. It's not quite as fundamental, but it's very close. And his Markoff blanket is very similar to other models in my work, like this. I believe that this is basically my informational Markoff blanket model. You can see it's calculative, so it's basically a self-referencing equation, but it's not self-referencing as in like, you know, this is equal to this minus this or something, or I don't know, this minus this. It's not returning any I don't know if it will tell us. No, I'm screwing up at doing a self-referencing equation, but you know that when you're in Excel and you do a self-referencing equation, you get like a little error and it shows you like, oh, this cannot be self-referencing. But this is as close to a self-referencing equation as you can model in Excel. And now I will explain that in other videos. But yeah, I think that's here.
It's how we act in the world, merely by existing and displacing a volume of air. Those are the A states, and the sensory states are the S states. And there are these causal links across all of them. And mathematically, you can model the sensory and active states as a Markov blanket. And there's a whole set of mathematical tooling that you get when you model things this way. And I think the way we can model what's going on is to understand that the set of states psi that constitute the world out there, the objective world, objective nature as it is in itself, those states are not physical states. Physical states are the A's and S's. The physical world is a Markov blanket that surrounds different living beings.
Exactly. That's true. The physical world is a Markov blanket that surrounds and is formed between living beings, I guess is a good way of putting it. I agree completely. And it's basically a Calabi-Yau manifold, kind of, but it's like a bodily representation of it. But yeah, that's that. I agree. Like I said, I agree with Bernardo on many things. That's that. That's the extent of the clips. Ask any final questions in the chat. I want to thank Brian Keating and Bernardo Kastrup for the stream that we talked about tonight. I think it was great. Like I said, I agree with more than I disagree. I think singularity theory obviously is the answer to many of the unsolved, is the structure that allows for the answering of many of the unsolved aspects of what was talked about tonight by the two of them. And I highly recommend watching their entire stream. It is linked below as well to Brian Keating's video. And don't just, watch my clips. If you really want to dive into their discussion, watch the link below. But like I said, I appreciate everybody here. Please hit the like button. Please hit the bell notification. Like I said, there will be no Discord call this week because it's my wife's birthday. And there won't be next week, I don't believe, because it's Thanksgiving. But then we will be back, and there will be the continuation of the Discord discussions at 7 p.m. I might reschedule this week's one, but I might not. It depends on how much time I have. But with that, everyone, please hit the like button. Please hit the bell notification. Share this with anybody you think will find it interesting. And comment any questions you would like me to address in the future below. Thank you, and